it is with great pleasure and anticipation that I'm going to learn something that I certainly don't know. We welcome Dr. Roberson. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I have to remember to keep those dates out now. You know how old I am. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today on behalf of Citizens for Science and Ethics. And what I'd like to do here today, next slide please, is to take you through, first of all, what this organization is about, why we were founded, and give you some scientific review, because the biggest, I think, problem in understanding science, in particular stem cell research, is that there's a lack of knowledge out there as to what it's about and where it's going. Talk about some of the scientific issues, the medical and ethical issues, which of course are very important, the business issues, which is important in this state and the country, and then some of the myths that are out there, and leave you with a few parting words. So in the first slide, which is the next slide, the mission of Citizens for Science and Ethics is to promote ethical stem cell research. We are for stem cell research, but ethical stem cell research. And so that's the first myth I'd like to dispel, not just for our organization, but for anyone who perhaps has spoken against embryonic stem cell research. We are for stem cell research. And in order to get this message across, we need to educate the general public, the legislators, on what is stem cell research, where we are in this research avenue, and how we can continue to promote and bring, indeed, cures to patients using stem cell research. So first, I think understanding the science is important, because if you don't understand the science, you really don't know how to make any kind of judgments and draw conclusions. You're not empowered. So I'll try and go through a little primer, if you will, of science here. But once understanding what's going on in science, then you have the facts. And that's, I think, all that we ask for, because no matter what your decision in the end, as long as it's an informed decision, that's what's important. So, and another thing to point out, that this is science I'm going to tell you about first, not ethics, not morality. And science has a very distinct field of its own. It cannot dictate right or wrong. So therefore, it really cannot judge in a moral sense, what is good for mankind. Next slide, please. Science determines what can be done and not what should be done. And I want you to keep that in the back of your mind, because you will and have heard many, many scientists and Nobel laureates get up there and tell you what is right in terms of ethics and morality. But you have to remember, if you're speaking from a scientific standpoint, I as a scientist cannot do that. I can tell you about things, but I can't tell you what's right about them. That's a whole nother area of exploration and rationale and judgment and conclusion. Next, please. So what are stem cells? They're basically very immature cells that are throughout the body. They're immature, they haven't grown up to be what they're going to be, so they're very unspecialized. And they can be triggered to become special cells. They can be triggered to become all kinds of cells, bone marrow, muscle, nerve, etc. So these cells are there, and they can be used very effectively when we find out how to trigger this differentiation or this maturation. We can determine how to use them to help in disease situations. For example, what we call cell replacement therapy. Being able to inject these stem cells into areas of the body, and we'll talk about an example later on in heart disease, to be able to inject them into the diseased tissues, and these stem cells, being healthy cells, can then be stimulated and will make more healthy cells and replace the diseased or damaged tissues. And bone marrow transplant, which has been around for a long, long time for treating leukemias, is probably a prime example. We just didn't know 25, 30 years ago that there was more that it could do besides just reconstitute bone marrow. So the message here from science, first, is that stem cells are the way the body repairs itself. Almost every normal tissue or organ has stem cells in it. and some perhaps just a few, a very small number of cells in relationship to the organ. But they're there, and that's how the body uses to fix things. So they are there, and science has been trying to find out a way to find these cells and use them. So what are the sources of stem cells? Well, through embryonic stem cells in vitro fertilization clinics that have embryos already formed. But just as a note, in the last survey that was done, there's only about 3% of the women who have actually agreed to have their embryonic stem cells used for any kind of research. Somatic cell nuclear transfer, SCNT. That's also been exchanged with the word therapeutic cloning, which I hate to use because it's by no means therapeutic to the embryo. But it's a means of taking DNA from any cell in the body, putting it into an egg, and letting it form an embryo that is very exactly like the person from which they took the DNA. So it's a clone. It's a way of cloning. Aborted fetuses have stem cells, and because they're very young, they have even a greater supply of those stem cells. Cord blood, and I'm sure you're aware of it because it's become more and more in the public eye, taking a baby's cord blood at birth and storing it, freezing it, because it's an excellent source for stem cells. Adult bone marrow, organs, as I said before, and fat. Wow, this is great. Finally, a good use for our fat. Fat cells have stem cells, and I'm going to tell you, in fact, there was a woman I had invited here today who's now the CEO of Goodwin Biotechnology. They have a client going into phase 1 clinical trials with cells obtained from fat to treat a very vicious disease. I can't tell you because it's confidential, but it's a disease that has no cure for it right now. So this is wonderful news. There are a variety of sources from stem cells. So when somebody says they're against stem cell research, it's usually someone who's against embryonic stem cell research, using the embryos from fertilization labs or from cloning. We have all these other sources of stem cells. Next, please. So what are the scientific issues here in terms of where is research right now today with stem cells and where is it going? When we look at embryonic stem cells, and of course you know there's a very big push to use embryonic stem cells. It is believed to be the only way we are going to get cures, the only promise for cures. And of course I remind you, you can say that 100 times, but that doesn't make it so. What I'm here to share with you is what we do know today. We know that embryonic stem cells, they are very flexible. That means they can become a lot of different adult-type cells. They're immortal. They can live forever. You can culture them in cell culture and keep them going. And they're available, of course, from donors or from the IVF clinics. The negative side of it is they do not, when they're maturing or differentiating into adult cell, they don't do it very evenly. They're sort of uncontrollable, and they're tumorigenic, and those two go hand in hand. And the reason they are is because of that pro over there. They're immortal. We can grow lots of cancer cells in cell culture, and we can generations and generations, years and years of growing them and freezing them down. If you take normal cells and try to grow them in culture, you can't grow them very far. So what does that tell you about the potential problem with embryonic stem cells, and indeed a problem that they have found and cannot yet overcome? So just from a scientific and physical standpoint, embryonic stem cells have a real challenge to become a useful therapy. I'm not saying that someday we can't overcome it, but it is a big hurdle to overcome right now. They are immunogenic, and this is something I think that is either misinformed or overlooked. First of all, if you take them from someone else, they're going to be rejected. But even in cloning, they are immunogenic, and the reason is because in human clones, and it's unique to humans and not to animals, there is a leftover of DNA, and it causes some immunogenicity. So even if you're taking your own cells and cloning them, you have a risk of rejection. It's not as big as the other risk, but there is a risk there. So these are all difficulties to overcome with embryonic stem cells. Adult stem cells, there's a much greater source for them, they are flexible. In fact, for bone marrow and cord blood, they are showing that they're as flexible as embryonic stem cells. They can become just about any cell in the body. They're somewhat specialized to begin, and that's why they don't have this immortality of the embryonic stem cells. They've kind of started to mature, but not very much. They can still become just about anything, but they've become more stable, and so they're less likely to become tumors, less likely to change genetically. They are not immunogenic because we can take these from the same patient that needs to be treated. Excuse me. They're easy to procure, and they don't cause tumors, and they don't harm the donor. And in this case, the donor is the embryo. The negative side of it, there is some limited quantities. And that is, you can't grow them for long periods of time, but you can grow them up enough to treat the patient, and you can freeze them down. For some sources, such as in adult tissue, there's a finite, time in culture. Bone marrow is, as I said, in cord blood, offer a much greater bank for stem cell research, and less flexible for certain tissue types, not in the case of bone marrow and cord blood.